On a stormy night, the single mother sheltered a stranger, but next morning she couldn't believe her eyes. On a stormy night, she opened the door to save a stranger, drenched and exhausted. The single mother's heart pounded between fear and compassion, never imagining what fate was weaving. But at dawn, when the light filled the room, her eyes widened. Before her stood not just any man, but someone who would change her life forever. The rain had started gently that evening, a soft drizzle tapping against the windows of the modest house tucked at the end of a narrow dirt road. By nightfall, however, the gentle rhythm had turned into a relentless downpour, the sky roaring with thunder as flashes of lightning streaked through the clouds. Inside the small home, Evelyn moved quietly through the kitchen, her tired hands washing the last of the dishes from dinner. The faint sound of water dripping into a bucket in the corner reminded her that the roof still leaked in the same place it had last winter. Sophie, her 7-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on a frayed rug in the living room, her eyes focused on a worn picture book she had read countless times. The pages were beginning to curl at the edges, and a few had been carefully taped together by Evelyn during one of her rare free afternoons. Sophie hummed softly to herself, occasionally glancing up to watch the shadows dance across the walls as the storm outside grew louder. Evelyn dried her hands on a dish towel and walked over to her daughter, crouching beside her and brushing a strand of curly hair behind the little girl's ear. "Time for bed, sweetheart," she said gently. Sophie looked up with sleepy eyes and nodded. "Will the storm go away by morning?" Evelyn smiled, though her eyes betrayed the fatigue beneath. "Storms always pass. You'll see." She tucked Sophie into the small bed they shared in the single bedroom of the house. The sheets were clean but worn, the mattress sagging slightly in the middle. Evelyn sat beside her for a moment, waiting until Sophie's breathing slowed and the rhythm of sleep settled in. Only then did she rise, careful not to wake her, and return to the kitchen. There was still laundry to fold, 2 loads from earlier that day, and Evelyn worked quietly, the soft hum of the old washing machine mixing with the sound of rain against the tin roof. She worked long hours cleaning houses in the neighboring town, and sometimes took on evening shifts at the local diner when the bills stacked up. Every dollar counted. Every minute of rest was a gift she couldn't afford to waste. The house they lived in had belonged to Evelyn's grandmother. It was small and aging, with crooked floors and peeling wallpaper, but it was theirs. Evelyn had inherited it after years of renting rooms and sleeping on couches. The sense of ownership, of stability, even in such a fragile form, was something she cherished deeply. Her thoughts wandered to the grocery list pinned to the fridge, to the rent notice due next week, to the holes in Sophie's only pair of winter shoes. There was always something, but Evelyn had learned long ago that worry didn't help. Only effort did. She had no family nearby, no close friends she could rely on. It was just her and Sophie, and that was enough. It had to be. The storm howled louder as the night deepened. A gust of wind rattled the window panes, and Evelyn pulled her thin cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She checked the locks on the door, a habit drilled into her by years of caution. Outside, the world was wild and wet, but inside she tried to keep things steady, safe. She sat for a moment in the old armchair, watching the faint glow of the table lamp flicker. The power had gone out twice already that month, and she worried it might go again tonight. Her mind ran through the morning's tasks: drop Sophie at school, clean the Petersons' house, pick up the evening shift if Carla was still sick. Then maybe, just maybe, she could rest. But tonight, something felt different. The storm had a strange rhythm, not just in sound, but in the way it pulsed through the air like something approaching. A change she couldn't name. She couldn't shake the feeling, though she told herself it was just exhaustion, just the way a hard day settled into the bones. She rose to check on Sophie again, placing a kiss on her forehead before heading back to the kitchen. The power flickered once more, the lights dimming to a soft amber before returning to full brightness. Evelyn stared at the window above the sink, where the rain had turned into sheets that blurred everything beyond the glass. It was a night to stay in, to stay hidden from the chaos outside. And yet, somewhere deep in her chest, something stirred. A sense that the night wouldn't end as quietly as others, that the rain might bring more than just puddles and broken branches. Evelyn shook her head, trying to brush off the feeling. There was no room in her life for uncertainty, for things that could not be planned. She folded the last shirt and stacked it neatly on the pile. The clock on the wall ticked steadily toward midnight. She moved to turn off the lights one by one and whispered a prayer for the roof to hold through the storm. The weight of sleep was beginning to pull at her when the first loud knock shattered the silence. A single heavy bang at the door, then another. She froze. The storm had hidden the sound at first, but now it was unmistakable. Someone was outside. The knock came again, louder this time, not frantic, but firm, deliberate. Evelyn stood frozen in the center of the room, her fingers clenched around the edge of the dish towel she still held. The storm outside had reached a fever pitch, thunder cracking with such force it felt like the earth itself was groaning. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring everything beyond the glass. And yet, someone was out there, standing in the darkness, knocking on her door in the middle of a storm. For a moment she didn't move. Her mind raced with every possibility, every danger that came with opening a door after midnight in a neighborhood where neighbors barely spoke, and the nearest police station was nearly an hour away. Her instinct told her to stay silent, to pretend no one was home. But something else, something softer, pushed against that fear. What if it was someone in trouble? What if it were her, stranded in the storm, needing help? She took a cautious step forward, then another. Sophie stirred in the bedroom, murmuring in her sleep, but did not wake. Evelyn glanced toward the hallway to be sure, then reached for the heavy wooden door. Her fingers hovered over the lock. She hesitated only a moment longer before slowly turning it. As she opened the door just a crack, wind rushed in, cold and sharp, bringing with it the scent of wet earth and desperation. A figure stood on the porch, tall, drenched and shivering. His hair clung to his forehead and his clothes were soaked through, dripping water onto the welcome mat that barely held together. For a second, Evelyn saw only the chaos, the storm behind him, the shadows on his face, the gleam of uncertainty in his eyes. I'm sorry, the man said quickly, breathless. I didn't mean to scare you. My car broke down, a few miles back. I've been walking for hours. I didn't know where else to go. His voice was hoarse but not aggressive. His words carried no demand, only exhaustion. He looked like he had been caught between the storm and something worse, and whatever strength he had left was fading fast. Evelyn's grip on the door tightened. She opened it another inch. You're lost. He nodded, arms wrapped around himself for warmth. I was heading south. Took the wrong turn trying to avoid the flooding. I thought I'd make it to the next town, but my car gave out. I have no phone signal. I just need a place to stay until morning. She studied him closely now. His features were rugged but not harsh, and there was a vulnerability in the way he stood, not just from the cold but from exposure, from having to ask a stranger for help. He looked like a man who wasn't used to relying on others and who now had no choice. Evelyn felt the old instincts rise, distrust, fear, the need to protect her daughter above all else. But behind those, something else whispered, the memory of being alone, of needing help and finding none. The endless nights when she had wished someone would knock on her door with a kind heart. The moments when she'd had to pretend to be stronger than she was just to survive one more day. She looked him over again. Wet boots, mud on his jeans, no bag, no umbrella, just a soaked jacket and a tired face. What's your name? She asked, her voice low but steady. Daniel, he said. Daniel Reeves. He didn't try to step closer, didn't push. He simply stood there, waiting, an open vulnerability in his posture that was rare to see in men, especially ones caught in the middle of a storm. Evelyn hesitated only a heartbeat longer before stepping back and opening the door wide. Come in, she said. Daniel blinked, surprised. Are you sure? It's freezing. You'll get sick. Just wipe your feet, please. He stepped inside, carefully, dripping water onto the old wooden floor. The door closed behind him with a low thud that seemed to muffle the storm at least a little. Evelyn quickly moved past him, grabbing a towel from the hallway closet and handing it to him. Dry off. I'll get you something warm to drink. Daniel nodded gratefully, peeling off his soaked jacket and using the towel to scrub at his hair and face. He still looked like a man trying to believe what was happening, that someone had actually let him in. Evelyn busied herself in the kitchen, heating a kettle and pouring instant coffee into a chipped mug. It wasn't much, but it was something. She glanced toward the hallway again, making sure Sophie hadn't woken. The girl slept like the dead when she finally gave in to sleep, but Evelyn couldn't shake the image of her daughter's curious eyes, watching this soaked stranger in her home. She returned to the living room with the mug and handed it to him. It's not gourmet, but it's hot. Daniel accepted it with both hands, the warmth making him shiver again as he brought it to his lips. Thank you, really. I didn't know if anyone would open their door. I was about ready to sleep in a ditch. Evelyn sat across from him, the armchair creaking under her weight. She studied him more closely now, the soft light of the table lamp revealing more of his features. He wasn't young, but not old either, perhaps in his early 40s. Lines around his eyes suggested years of hard work, and something about the way he held the mug told her he wasn't used to being idle. "Where were you coming from?" she asked, not harshly, but with enough curiosity to let him know she wasn't careless. "I own farmland north of here," he said. "Had gone to check on one of the smaller properties after the rain started. It wasn't supposed to be this bad. When I headed back, the road was blocked. I tried to reroute, but I ended up somewhere completely unfamiliar. Then the engine died." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You own farmland?" He gave a half smile, a little sheepish. "Yeah, it's a long story. Right now I just need a roof until sunrise. I'll call someone as soon as I have signal." She didn't respond right away. Her eyes drifted to the window, where the rain continued to pour. She thought about all the nights she had spent wondering if anyone would ever reach out to her when she was at her lowest. And now here she was, faced with a stranger who clearly didn't belong in her world, and yet had ended up on her doorstep. "All right," she finally said. "You can stay on the couch. I'll get you some blankets." Daniel exhaled in relief. "Thank you. I mean it." Evelyn stood, nodding. "Just for the night. In the morning, you'll call someone and go." "Of course." As she retrieved the blankets, she tried to ignore the uneasy flutter in her chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness of the man in her living room, of the strange kindness that had brought them together, however briefly. She reminded herself that people didn't just stumble into your life by accident. Sometimes the storm had a purpose. And that night, as she lay beside her sleeping daughter, Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if the knock on her door had been a mistake, or the beginning of something she never saw coming. The house settled into a heavy silence after Evelyn handed Daniel a second blanket and pointed him toward the worn sofa in the corner of the living room. She watched him for a moment as he arranged the cushions with a kind of quiet reverence, as if he understood the weight of being allowed in. He didn't speak again, didn't make small talk, and for that Evelyn was grateful. Her trust wasn't easily earned, and he didn't seem to be trying to rush it. That, perhaps more than anything, gave her a sliver of peace. She turned off the lamp and walked quietly back to the bedroom. Careful not to wake Sophie, the girl lay curled up with her favorite stuffed rabbit, one arm flung carelessly over the edge of the bed, breathing slow and steady. Evelyn watched her for a moment, the way any mother might when life feels unpredictable. Sophie's innocence was still intact, her world still small, still safe, at least for now. Sliding under the thin blanket, Evelyn didn't close her eyes immediately. The house creaked softly around her, every sound magnified by her alertness. She could hear the wind tapping branches against the side of the house and the occasional thunder still grumbling in the distance. But beneath all of that was something else, a presence that now occupied the same space as her and her daughter. A stranger, sleeping just one thin wall away. Her thoughts tangled. She had spent her whole adult life being cautious, not out of fear, but necessity. There was no one else to lean on, no one to help if she miscalculated. Every decision, every risk had to be measured and carried on her shoulders alone. And yet, tonight, something had shifted. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the look in his eyes. Maybe it was simply the unbearable thought of what she might become if she stopped believing that some people were still good. She didn't remember falling asleep, but morning crept in slowly, light filtering through the cracked curtains and casting long shadows on the wooden floor. Evelyn blinked awake, disoriented at first. Then she remembered. The knock, the rain, the man named Daniel. Sitting up carefully, she slipped out of bed and padded down the hall. The living room was quiet, too quiet. Her heart skipped for a moment. Had he left in the night, taken something? She turned the corner and paused. Daniel was there, sitting on the sofa, now fully dressed in dry clothes. His hair was neatly combed back, and in his hands he held a steaming cup of coffee. But what startled her wasn't his appearance. It was the smell of food. Real food. Evelyn's eyes shifted to the kitchen, where the small stove was lit, and the scent of eggs and toast filled the room. A pot of fresh coffee sat on the counter. Her jaw tightened instinctively. He had gone into her kitchen, touched her things, used what little she had without asking. But before she could speak, he turned to her, standing slowly and setting the cup down. "I hope you don't mind," he said gently. "I wanted to say thank you for last night. I figured the least I could do was make breakfast." His tone wasn't casual. There was a quiet reverence in it, a gratitude that didn't feel rehearsed. He moved with a kind of humility, and Evelyn noticed now that the clothes he wore, clean jeans and a crisp button-up shirt, didn't quite match the image of the drenched, broken man from the night before. She crossed her arms. "You went through my kitchen." "I did," he admitted. "I should have asked. I'm sorry. I just thought maybe it would make things easier." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She looked around the kitchen. He had used her last 3 eggs, the good bread she had been saving. Even the small jar of homemade jam she rationed out sparingly. But he had cleaned everything, set the table with the care of someone who respected every item he had touched. He hadn't taken anything, he had given something back. From the hallway, small footsteps echoed. Sophie appeared, rubbing her eyes, her curls wild and tangled from sleep. When she saw Daniel, she paused, tilting her head in that way children do when trying to make sense of something unfamiliar. Evelyn instinctively stepped between them. Daniel crouched slightly, not too close. "Hi," he said, his voice soft. "You must be Sophie." The little girl nodded, clinging to the doorframe. "Are you the man from the rain?" He smiled. "Yes, I'm Daniel. Your mum let me sleep on the couch last night." Sophie looked at her mother, then back at him. "You made toast?" He chuckled lightly. "I did." She looked at Evelyn again. Evelyn nodded once. Sophie took a step forward, then another, and finally sat down at the table. That simple exchange shifted something in Evelyn. The way Daniel had waited, respected the space, met her daughter with gentleness. It didn't feel forced. It felt genuine. They ate in near silence, the occasional clink of forks against plates the only sound. When Sophie had finished, she climbed into her mother's lap and began humming softly, her small hand resting on Evelyn's. Daniel stood, cleared the dishes, and washed them without being asked. Once Sophie had wandered back to her room, Evelyn turned to him. "You're not who I thought you were." He looked up. "Who did you think I was?" "Lost, desperate, maybe dangerous." Daniel nodded, not offended. "I was lost. Desperate too. As for dangerous, no. But I don't blame you for wondering." Evelyn studied him again. There was a calm in his eyes now, a steadiness that hadn't been there the night before. "You said you own farmland?" He nodded. "A few properties north of here, mostly managed by crews now. I grew up in the area, but I've been away for years. Came back to help with the family business after my father passed. Was checking on a site yesterday when the roads flooded. And the car? Still dead," he said with a faint smile. "I'll have it towed when I get signal." Evelyn remained quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that had been on her mind since she opened the door. "Why did you knock on my door?" He hesitated, then said, "Because your porch light was on, that's all. It was the only house that didn't look abandoned." A simple answer, and perhaps in that simplicity something profound. A porch light left on out of habit had brought a man to her door. A man who now stood in her kitchen, washing her dishes as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When he turned off the tap and dried his hands, Daniel met her gaze. "I'll be out of your way soon. I don't want to impose." "You haven't." That was all she said, but it was enough, because in that moment, Evelyn wasn't just acknowledging his presence. She was admitting, perhaps for the first time in years, that she didn't have to carry everything alone. That kindness could knock on her door and not always come with a price. That maybe, just maybe, there was more waiting for her beyond survival. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel so alone. That evening, the storm had dwindled into a steady drizzle, soft enough that the world outside no longer felt like a threat. The air carried a damp chill, and the wind occasionally pushed droplets against the windows like a quiet reminder of the night before. Evelyn moved through her small home with a new kind of presence. Not rushed or burdened as usual, but contemplative. Something had shifted between sunrise and sunset, though she couldn't yet name it. Daniel had stayed the entire day. Not because she'd invited him to, not exactly, but because his car was still dead and there was no signal for him to call for help. She'd gone about her usual routine, making lunch, folding clothes, organizing the supply shelf in the pantry, while he quietly offered to assist, never imposing. He'd fixed a broken cabinet hinge, rebalanced a crooked door, and even helped patch the leak in the ceiling with a bit of leftover tarp she'd forgotten she had, all without ever overstepping. He was present, but never in the way. Sophie had warmed to him faster than Evelyn expected. By mid-afternoon, she was asking him questions, childish, endless questions. What kind of animals lived on a farm? Had he ever ridden a horse? Did he know how to drive a tractor? Evelyn watched from the corner of the room as Daniel knelt on the floor beside her daughter, patiently answering every single one with a soft humor that made Sophie giggle. The sound was rare in the house. That sound alone made Evelyn pause more than once. Now, as night approached again, Evelyn lit a few candles on the kitchen table. The power had held all day, but she liked the warmth the flickering light brought. It softened the sharpness of the space. The old linoleum floor, the mismatched chairs, the paint peeling around the window frames. With the lights low, her home felt less tired and more like a secret corner of the world, a place where time didn't rush and worry took the night off. Sophie had fallen asleep early, her small body curled beneath the quilt in their shared room, her breathing deep and rhythmic. Evelyn peeked in to check on her, then returned to the kitchen where Daniel was finishing drying the last dish. The meal had been simple. Beans and rice, the last of the good tomatoes, a few slices of bread. He had eaten without complaint, even offered to cook again, but Evelyn insisted on doing it herself. Daniel placed the dish towel over the sink and turned. "She's a sweet girl," he said, nodding toward the hallway. Evelyn sat down slowly at the table. "She is. She's everything." He didn't sit right away. His hand rested lightly on the back of the chair across from her, as if waiting for permission. She gave a slight nod and he took the seat. For a moment there was only silence, not awkward but full, the kind of silence that held meaning. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the warm mug of tea in front of her, then glanced at him. "You don't have to keep thanking me," she said. "You were in trouble. Anyone would have done the same." He gave a soft smile. "I'm not sure that's true." "Well, maybe not everyone, but I don't like thinking that kindness has become rare." Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think it's rare? Or do you think people have just forgotten how much it matters?" Evelyn considered that. The world had hardened her in ways she didn't often speak of. Absent family, empty promises, nights spent scraping together just enough to pay for gas, electricity, and a single loaf of bread. But even with all of that, she had never let go of the small hope that someone, somewhere, still believed in helping without expecting anything in return. "I think people are tired," she finally said. "Tired of struggling, tired of giving and getting nothing back." Daniel nodded. "I was one of those people once, for a long time." "You?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I worked in finance in the city," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "For nearly 15 years. I made money, good money, but I didn't know peace. I didn't know real connection. I had everything, except the things that mattered." "What changed?" "My father died," he said simply. "The farm he left me. I didn't want it. I saw it as a burden, but I went back out of duty. Something about being there on that land, breathing that air, it reminded me of who I used to be, before the office towers, before the long meetings, before I forgot how to really live." Evelyn listened without interrupting. She studied the way his voice softened when he spoke of the farm, how the tension around his eyes faded when he described being far from the city. There was something deeply honest in his words, something unpolished and true. He met her gaze across the candlelight. "And you? How did you end up here?" Evelyn hesitated. "Life didn't give me many choices. I got pregnant young. Sophie's father didn't stick around. I cleaned houses, waited tables, did what I had to. This house belonged to my grandmother. I inherited it when she passed. It's not much, but it's ours." It's more than most have, he said. She looked around the room, the cracked tiles, the chipped paint, the ancient fridge humming in the background. Sometimes it feels like less. But it's warm, he said. It's safe. There's laughter. And love. That's not less. His words settled into the space between them like a soft blanket. Evelyn found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn to the steadiness in his presence. She hadn't spoken to a man like this in years, not with vulnerability, not without the shadow of caution hanging between every sentence. I stopped trusting people a long time ago, she said quietly. Daniel didn't flinch. I understand. But something about you... She stopped herself. He waited, not pushing, not demanding. She shook her head. Maybe it's the way you talk, or the way you look at Sophie, like you see her, really see her. Most people don't even notice her. I do, he said simply. That truth lingered. The candlelight flickered, casting soft shadows along the walls. Evelyn felt something inside her stir, a quiet hope she hadn't dared feed in a long time. She wasn't sure if it was the calm in Daniel's voice or the way he listened, truly listened, without the usual judgment or interruption. It made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected, in a way she didn't realize she needed. They spoke until the candle melted low, the flame no more than a flicker against the glass. Stories were exchanged, not grand tales, but the kind that carried weight. Memories of family, of childhood, of the roads they had both taken to arrive at this very table. When the time came to part for the night, Daniel stood and thanked her again, but this time it wasn't for the food or the roof. It was for the conversation. "Good night, Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet. "Good night, Daniel," she replied. And as she turned out the last light and returned to the room where Sophie slept, Evelyn felt something unfamiliar, but welcome, blooming in her chest. A sense that perhaps the storm had brought her more than just rain. Perhaps it had brought the first spark of something new, something rare and precious. A gentle beginning disguised as a knock on the door. The morning after their long conversation arrived, wrapped in silence. The storm had finally passed, leaving the sky washed clean in soft shades of gray and blue. The sun hesitated behind scattered clouds, peeking through now and then as if unsure whether it was welcome yet. The air smelled like earth and damp wood, the scent of renewal after a hard cleansing. In the quiet of dawn, Evelyn woke to a home that felt momentarily lighter, as if the very walls had exhaled after a long-held breath. She rose slowly, careful not to disturb Sophie, who was still curled under the quilt. Her cheeks flushed with the peaceful warmth of uninterrupted sleep. There was a stillness to the house that didn't feel empty, but rather anticipatory. Evelyn padded down the hallway barefoot, her steps soft against the worn wooden floor. But when she turned the corner into the kitchen, she stopped. Daniel was already there. He stood by the stove, wearing clothes that were clearly not the ones he had worn the past 2 days. His jeans were pressed and clean, his shirt tucked neatly, the collar crisp. His shoes, no longer caked with dried mud, looked almost new. His hair was combed and styled simply, and he held a sleek phone in one hand, something Evelyn hadn't seen before. More startling than all of that was the car. Through the kitchen window, just beyond the front porch, a black vehicle gleamed beneath the morning light. Not the battered pickup that had broken down on some rural road, but a luxury sedan, shiny, smooth-lined, and clearly expensive. It sat in quiet elegance like it had always belonged there, like it had not arrived in the middle of a storm, or with a man soaking wet and desperate for shelter. Evelyn blinked, the edges of confusion curling around her thoughts. Daniel turned as if he had sensed her, his expression soft but unmistakably changed. There was no trace of the vulnerable man who had stood dripping water on her welcome mat, no exhaustion in his shoulders. He looked composed. He looked like someone used to being in control. And yet, when he met her eyes, something unguarded still lingered in his gaze. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and calm. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She stepped further into the room, her eyes darting once more toward the car, then to the phone in his hand. "Where did that come from?" Daniel followed her glance. "I called my assistant early this morning when I finally picked up a signal. She had someone bring a car out and a change of clothes." She folded her arms, her mind racing to connect the pieces. "Assistant?" He nodded slowly. "There's something I haven't told you. I didn't mean to keep it from you, but last night, I wanted to be seen for who I was in that moment, not for what I have." Evelyn felt her chest tighten. She wasn't angry yet, not exactly, but suspicion pressed against her, as it had when she first opened the door to him. "And who are you really?" Daniel set the phone down gently and took a step toward her, not invading her space but closing the gap just enough to bridge the distance of truth. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I told you that part. What I didn't say is that I own multiple agricultural properties across this region, some inherited from my father, others I expanded over the last few years. I'm not just a landowner. I manage a small group of businesses, organic produce, distribution lines, even a few commercial investments. I'm not a billionaire, but I've done well." The words didn't come out as arrogant. There was no pride in his tone, only clarity. Evelyn stared at him, her arms still crossed. "So you lied." "I didn't," he replied calmly. "I just didn't give you all the information. I wasn't hiding because I was ashamed. I was grateful for your kindness, your home, your conversation. But if I had knocked on your door in a pressed shirt and nice shoes, I don't think we'd be standing here having this talk." Evelyn's instincts flared. Memories of men who said the right things with the wrong motives. She had seen charm used as a weapon, softness turned into bait. And yet, this didn't feel like that. Still, caution was a language she understood better than hope. "And now?" she asked. Daniel offered a small smile. "Now I'm telling you the truth. All of it." He reached for the stove, lifting the kettle and pouring water into two mismatched mugs. The familiarity of the action disarmed her slightly. He still remembered where she kept the tea bags. He handed her a cup without saying anything more and waited as she took it, her fingers wrapping slowly around the warmth. "So, what happens now?" Evelyn asked, voice quieter than before. "That's up to you," he said. "I meant what I said the other night, about being changed by your kindness, about how rare it is. I came to your door with nothing but need, and you gave me a place at your table. You didn't care who I was. You cared that I was cold, tired, and lost. That means something." He paused, then continued. "I don't want to turn your world upside down. I'm not here to rescue anyone or write a fairy tale, but I do want to be honest about who I am. And if that means walking away now that you know, I'll respect that." Evelyn studied him. She didn't feel threatened. She felt challenged by the idea that her small act of compassion had opened the door to something unexpected. She had never asked for anything more than peace and stability. Dreams were luxuries she hadn't allowed herself, yet here stood a man who represented the very things she had taught herself to live without. And still, part of her ached at the idea of him leaving. She took a breath. "Why are you still here?" Daniel met her eyes. "Because you didn't ask me to go." It was the simplest answer, the most honest. Behind them, a sleepy voice drifted into the kitchen. "Mommy?" Evelyn turned to see Sophie standing in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, her stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. Daniel crouched instinctively, opening his arms just slightly. Sophie didn't hesitate. She walked straight to him and leaned into his side, the kind of affection that didn't question status or wealth or pasts, just trust. Evelyn watched her daughter rest her head on Daniel's shoulder. The man who had arrived soaked and trembling, who now looked like someone from a different world, had somehow found a place in theirs. "I have to go into town for a meeting later this morning," Daniel said softly, still holding Sophie's hand. "But I'd like to come back, if that's all right with you." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at the car, shiny, out of place against the patchy grass and cracked driveway. She looked at the phone, at the shirt that probably cost more than her monthly groceries. Then she looked at the man who had listened to her fears in candlelight and washed dishes like he belonged there. Finally, she looked at her daughter's face, peaceful, trusting, unguarded. "Come back for dinner," Evelyn said. "But you're cooking." Daniel smiled. "Deal." And in that quiet moment, the edges of her world began to stretch just enough to let something new in. Not fantasy, not rescue, but perhaps, just perhaps, the beginning of trust. The afternoon passed in slow, golden stretches. Evelyn spent the hours cleaning, not out of necessity, but out of the peculiar energy that often comes with anticipation. Every surface she wiped, every corner she straightened, felt like a quiet preparation for something she didn't quite understand yet. It wasn't about impressing him. Daniel had already seen her home in its raw, ordinary state. but about creating a space that reflected how she felt inside, cautiously hopeful. Sophie helped in her own way, dusting shelves with the mismatched socks she wore on her hands and singing to her stuffed rabbit while she worked. Evelyn watched her from time to time, the way her daughter moved through the house with the joy of someone untouched by the world's harder edges. That joy was part of what Evelyn had spent years protecting, sacrificing for, nurturing in the face of everything that might steal it away. By the time the sun had started to slip behind the hills, Evelyn was chopping vegetables in the kitchen, preparing a salad to go with whatever Daniel would bring. She didn't know what to expect, a gourmet dish or something simple, but she found herself looking forward to it, to him, and that, more than anything, made her pause. It had been years since a man's return felt like something to look forward to, years since she had allowed herself the luxury of imagining that someone could walk into her world not to disrupt it, but to understand it. When Daniel arrived just after 6 o'clock in the evening, he didn't knock. He called out gently from the porch, "Evelyn?" and waited until she opened the door. He held 2 brown paper bags and wore a navy sweater over a clean white shirt. The scent of roasted garlic and herbs trailed behind him like a promise. She stepped aside and let him in. He moved with familiarity now, as though the house had welcomed him before. He placed the bags on the counter and began unpacking dishes: grilled chicken with rosemary, roasted potatoes with thyme, steamed green beans with lemon zest. Everything still warm, carefully packed in reusable containers, not a trace of pretension. "It's nothing fancy," he said as he unpacked. "Just something I make when I want to feel grounded." Evelyn couldn't help but smile. "Well, it smells like something from one of those high-end places in town." Daniel laughed softly. "Maybe, but I promise it was made in a humble kitchen with a clumsy dog underfoot and a playlist of old country songs." They set the table together. Sophie joined them, her hair brushed into a neat ponytail, wearing her favorite dress, the one with the tiny sunflowers stitched along the hem. She climbed into her chair and looked at the food with wide, excited eyes. "You made all this?" she asked Daniel. He nodded. "With a little help from my neighbor's garden." Sophie beamed. "It smells better than school lunch." Dinner passed with surprising ease. Conversation flowed like a quiet river, steady, warm, without effort. Daniel told stories from his childhood. Summers spent chasing chickens, the time he broke his arm falling out of an apple tree, how his mother made pancakes in the shape of letters when he had trouble learning to read. Evelyn listened, sometimes laughing, sometimes just watching the way he spoke with Sophie, as if she were an equal in the conversation, not just a child to be tolerated. She didn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her daughter that way, genuinely, respectfully, as if her words mattered. After the dishes were cleared, and Sophie had gone off to her room with her rabbit and a new storybook Daniel had brought, Evelyn and Daniel found themselves sitting in the living room, a quiet rhythm settling between them. "I keep wondering," she said after a moment, "why you came to my door that night. I know you said it was the porch light, but something about it still feels bigger than that." Daniel leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I've asked myself the same thing more than once." "And?" she pressed. He was silent for a moment, then turned toward her, his voice low. "Before the storm, I had been thinking about selling everything. The farms, the land, moving back to the city, starting something new. I was restless. Nothing I had felt like it meant anything anymore. I had built this life that looked perfect from the outside, but it didn't feel real. I was surrounded by people who only knew me for what I owned or what I could give them." He paused. "And then my car broke down in the middle of nowhere. I lost my signal. I had no map, no plan. Just a storm chasing me and a road that led here, to your house." Evelyn listened in silence, her heart beating a little faster. "That night," he continued, "was supposed to be just about getting through the rain. But you opened the door. You didn't ask for anything in return. You didn't even hesitate." "I hesitated," she said softly. He smiled. "Maybe. But you still opened it. You saw me, not as a problem or a threat, but as someone in need. That changed something in me." His words were steady, but not rehearsed. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was telling the truth the only way he knew how, plainly, like a man who had spent enough time alone with his thoughts to understand their weight. "I've spent so long being surrounded by people who expect me to have all the answers," he said, "but that night I needed help, and you gave it to me without knowing anything about who I was." Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. "And now that you know who I am, I see someone strong," he said without hesitation. "Someone who keeps going, even when the world doesn't make it easy. Someone who's built something real out of almost nothing. That's not just resilience, Evelyn. That's grace." The silence that followed was not empty, but full of everything they didn't need to say out loud. She looked down at her hands, rough from years of cleaning, cooking, fixing. Hands that had held a baby alone in the dark, had lifted boxes during moves, had scrubbed floors on aching knees. And here was this man seeing something beautiful in her scars. "I don't know where this goes," she said. "I don't have the time or luxury for fantasies." "I'm not asking for a fantasy," he replied gently. "Just a chance to keep showing up, however you'll let me." Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, the warmth between them was undeniable. Evelyn didn't give an answer that night. She didn't need to, because sometimes hope doesn't arrive with fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it's a quiet dinner, a shared story, a knock in the rain that leads to a voice in the dark saying, "You're not alone." And maybe that was all she needed for now. The following days unfolded in a rhythm that felt foreign, but strangely welcome. Evelyn continued her routines, though with a renewed sense of alertness, as if her senses had been subtly awakened. The scent of morning coffee seemed richer, the sunlight pouring through the curtains somehow warmer. She didn't speak about it, not even to herself, but something within her was undeniably shifting. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was something deeper, the possibility of being seen, heard, valued. She had spent so many years surviving that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist in someone's gentle regard. Daniel's visits were never loud or disruptive. He came with ease, with no grand gestures or expectations. He helped where he could, listened when words felt too heavy, and brought small things for Sophie. Coloring pencils, a paperback fairy tale, once even a basket of ripe peaches that made the whole kitchen smell like summer. But Evelyn could tell that he wasn't trying to win her over. It wasn't performative, it was natural, thoughtful, grounded. On a Saturday morning, a week after that first stormy night, Daniel arrived just as Evelyn was coming back from the town market. Her arms were full of groceries she had carefully selected, based on a tight budget and the usual list of necessities. She hadn't expected him that early, and she was flushed from the sun and the weight of the bags. "I would have helped," he said, stepping out of his truck and quickly reaching to lighten her load. "You weren't invited," she replied, though her voice carried more warmth than reproach. "I came to change that," he said with a smile. "Can we talk for a minute? I won't take much of your time." She led him into the house, placed the bags on the counter, and motioned for him to sit. Sophie was at her friend's house down the road, and the quiet gave the moment an unusual intimacy. Daniel didn't sit immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and then faced her with a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, "about what you did for me, about how easy it would have been to close the door, to walk away. But you didn't. And I don't want to just say thank you. I want to show you what your kindness meant." Evelyn furrowed her brow, already uneasy with the direction of the conversation. She had always been uncomfortable with the idea of reward for compassion. Helping someone wasn't supposed to come with strings or debts. "You don't owe me anything, Daniel," she said softly. "I know I don't," he replied. "This isn't about owing, it's about offering." She crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "I want to offer you and Sophie a place to live," he said plainly. "Not out of charity, not out of pity, but because I believe you deserve something better. There's a house on one of my properties. It's bigger, safe, close to good schools. You'd have your own space, a proper kitchen, a garden, if you like that kind of thing." Evelyn stared at him, speechless. "I also want to offer you a job," he continued. "One of the administrative offices on the farm is understaffed. You'd get full training, flexible hours to work around Sophie's needs, and it pays better than cleaning houses by far." The room felt suddenly too quiet. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, not from excitement but from the storm of questions racing through her. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would you do all this?" Daniel met her gaze, his expression clear. "Because I see your strength, your integrity. Because people like you are the ones who deserve the world to bend a little in their favor for once, Because I can, and because it matters." She looked away, her throat tightening. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her like that. Years since anyone had looked at her and seen more than a tired woman in second-hand clothes. It wasn't the offer that overwhelmed her. It was the sincerity behind it. "I've worked hard to keep things steady," she said quietly, "to protect Sophie. We don't need much, just enough." "I know," he replied, "and I'm not here to take that away. I'm offering a new version of enough, one that doesn't wear you down every day." She shook her head, still hesitant. "It sounds too good to be true." Daniel didn't argue, he didn't push, he simply said, "Come see the place. No promises, no pressure. Just look. Bring Sophie. Let it be your decision." Evelyn didn't give an answer then. Her instincts screamed caution, but another part of her, smaller, quieter but persistent, whispered something different. What if he was telling the truth? What if this wasn't a trap, but a door? Not a fantasy, but a chance. That night, after Sophie was asleep and the house was silent once more, Evelyn sat by the window and watched the moonlight spill across the front yard. She thought of the years behind her, the long days, the lonely nights, the weight of doing everything alone. She thought of Sophie and the future she wanted to give her. And she thought of Daniel, his eyes steady, his offer gentle. Sometimes life knocks when you least expect it, and sometimes it waits patiently at the door until you're ready to open it all the way. Evelyn didn't sleep that night, not in the way people normally do. She closed her eyes, sure. She lay in bed beside Sophie, her hand resting lightly over her daughter's back, feeling the rise and fall of each gentle breath. But her mind wandered in loops, turning over every word Daniel had said, every expression on his face, every detail of the offer that had quietly overturned the stability she had spent years building. Her instincts warred with her hopes, and both were equally loud. She had spent the last 7 years creating a life that didn't depend on anyone else. It wasn't luxurious, not even comfortable, but it was safe, controlled, predictable. She knew how much every bill would cost, which neighbors she could trust in a pinch, and how far she could stretch a bag of groceries. She didn't rely on favors. She didn't ask for help, not because of pride, but because experience had taught her that help often came with strings. And yet here was Daniel, a man who had entered her life during a storm, literally and figuratively, and had offered more than she'd ever been taught to believe was available to someone like her. A new home, a steady job, stability. She had spent so long providing those things for others that she had stopped dreaming they could be offered to her. By the time morning broke, Evelyn was exhausted, but strangely calm. There was no decision made, not yet, but she was no longer afraid of hearing the offer in her head. That at least felt like progress. Daniel arrived just before noon. He didn't show up with gifts or with a pitch. He simply knocked, and when she opened the door, he smiled like he always did, soft, unassuming, and respectful. "I brought the address," he said, holding out a small folded paper. "Take your time. There's no rush." Evelyn took it with a nod. She didn't invite him in, not because she didn't want to, but because this wasn't a moment that needed warmth or distraction. It needed space. Daniel seemed to understand. He gave her a look of quiet support and turned back toward his car without waiting for her to say anything more. She unfolded the paper once he was gone. Written in neat handwriting was a name, Maple Ridge Farm, followed by an address, directions, and a short note beneath. No pressure, just possibility. Evelyn stared at those last 2 words for a long time. That afternoon, she packed a small bag with snacks and water for Sophie, dressed her in clean jeans and her favorite yellow sweater, and told her they were going on a drive. She didn't say where or why. Sophie didn't ask. The girl had learned early that when her mother needed silence, it wasn't sadness, it was thought. Sophie had always known how to read her without words. They drove through quiet roads, passing long stretches of fields and scattered trees, turning the gentle shades of late summer. The air was cool but not cold, and the sky had a soft haze to it that made the world seem half asleep. When they arrived, Evelyn slowed the car as they approached the driveway. It wasn't what she expected. Not a grand estate, not a showpiece. It was a house that looked lived in, loved even. A wraparound porch, white with green shutters, and a small front yard bordered with lavender and rose bushes. There was no gate, no sign of luxury shouting at them. Just peace. Sophie leaned forward. "Is this it?" Evelyn nodded. "I think so." They stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. A breeze swept through the trees, carrying the faint scent of soil and flowers. There was a quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt intentional, like the land itself knew how to offer silence as comfort. A woman stepped onto the porch as they approached, middle-aged, wearing denim overalls and rubber boots, her grey hair tied in a braid. She smiled and waved. "You must be Evelyn," she said. "Daniel told me to expect you. I'm Margaret. I help manage the place." Evelyn smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you." "No pressure to stay long," Margaret said, walking them up the steps. "But take your time. Explore. See how it feels." She handed over a set of keys and stepped back. Inside, the house was warm with natural light. The windows were large, letting in the soft gold of the afternoon sun. Wooden floors, simple furniture, a kitchen with real counters, and enough space to cook without turning sideways. There was a fireplace in the living room, a couch that looked comfortable enough to nap on, and bookshelves already filled. Nothing about it felt staged. It felt real. Sophie ran ahead, her laughter echoing as she discovered the bedroom meant for her. Painted a soft blue with a window seat, a bookshelf filled with fairy tales, and a bed with a colorful quilt. She turned to her mother, eyes shining. "Can we live here?" Evelyn couldn't answer. Her throat was tight, her chest full of emotion she didn't know how to name. She had imagined this room before, not the exact walls or color, but the feeling of it. A space where her daughter could breathe, where she could grow up with a sense of safety and calm. She walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, running her hand along the banister. Everything felt like it was waiting, not just for anyone, but for her. Margaret met them on the porch as they stepped out an hour later. "Well?" "It's beautiful," Evelyn said, her voice quiet. "No need to decide now," Margaret replied. "But Daniel said to tell you, whatever you choose, he's grateful." On the drive back, Sophie was quieter than usual. She looked out the window, then finally asked, "Why wouldn't we live there, Mommy?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She gripped the steering wheel, eyes focused on the road. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "grown-ups are afraid of good things, afraid they might not last." "But what if they do?" Sophie whispered. Evelyn glanced at her daughter, at the hope in her eyes, the belief that things could change, could get better. And she wondered, for the first time in a long while, what it would mean to believe that too. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Evelyn sat in the kitchen with the folded piece of paper in front of her. She read the words again. No pressure, just possibility. Maybe it was time to stop expecting everything good to vanish. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start living. The following morning arrived with quiet certainty, as if the sun itself knew Evelyn would wake up, carrying a question she could no longer avoid. The light crept gently into the small bedroom, brushing against the edges of the worn quilt where Sophie still lay curled in sleep. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter's face, calm and unaware, and wondered if this was the moment she had been waiting for without even realizing it. The offer still lived in her mind, like a song heard once and never forgotten. Every corner of that farmhouse had felt like a whispered promise of peace, of belonging, of a life not driven by anxiety or scarcity. The image of Sophie spinning in the middle of that sunlit bedroom, cheeks flushed with joy, lingered in Evelyn's heart with stubborn persistence. It wasn't just about comfort or beauty. It was about the chance to choose something that wasn't defined by desperation. But fear, like a faithful shadow, followed her through every thought. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. It reminded her of all the times life had made her pay for trusting too quickly, for hoping too deeply. She had seen kindness twisted, generosity withdrawn, good things turned into leverage. She knew what it meant to depend on others, and then watch them vanish. Her bones remembered the coldness of empty rooms and unanswered calls. And now Daniel had offered her not only a home but a job, stability, dignity, a space where she could breathe. He had done it without asking for anything, without pushing. He had simply opened a door and waited. Evelyn didn't know how to walk through it. She moved through the house like someone balancing a fragile truth. She made Sophie's breakfast, swept the porch, folded the laundry. But everything she touched was layered with distraction. When Daniel's name came to mind, and it did often, She felt a strange ache that wasn't pain but recognition. He had become more than just a man who had arrived in the rain. He was now a symbol of something more dangerous than hardship, the possibility that life could soften if she let it. Late that afternoon, while Sophie played with her stuffed animals on the rug, Evelyn stepped outside and sat on the porch, letting the breeze tug at her thoughts. The air carried the scent of soil, warm wood, and distant pine. Her hands rested in her lap, but her mind wandered to that white farmhouse and the sound of Daniel's voice, always steady, never demanding. She remembered something he had said days ago, something quiet that she hadn't let herself absorb at the time. "I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering room to breathe. Room to breathe." The words surfaced now with new clarity. She hadn't wanted to admit how little of that she'd had in years. Her world had shrunk to schedules, debt, and Sophie's needs. Every decision was weighed against cost. Every joy was measured against necessity. She had become so used to surviving that thriving felt like a distant language. When Daniel called that evening, his voice on the other end was calm, careful. "I don't want to bother you," he said, "but I wanted to check in, just see how you're doing." Evelyn's voice was steadier than she felt. "I've been thinking. I figured you might be." She hesitated, then asked the question that had sat quietly in the back of her mind. "Why me, Daniel? Why not just offer that house to someone else? Someone with experience? Someone who fits more easily into your life?" There was a pause before he answered. "Because when I met you, I didn't see someone broken. I saw someone strong who's been carrying everything alone for too long. And maybe I've built a life that looks stable, but it never felt whole. Not until I sat in your kitchen, watching you care for your daughter with more love and strength than I've ever seen in boardrooms or bank accounts. You reminded me of what matters." His words didn't rush. They arrived like a slow tide, deliberate and sincere. "I know you're not looking for help," he continued. "I know you've survived without it. But I also know that you deserve more than just survival. And I want to give you space to have that, if you choose it." Evelyn didn't cry, but her eyes stung. Not from the offer, but from the honesty. From the rare gentleness in being seen not as someone in need, but as someone worthy of more. "I'm scared," she admitted quietly. "Not of you, but of losing everything again. Of getting used to something good and then watching it disappear. I can't promise forever," he said. "No one can. But I can promise that I'm not here for the short run. And I won't disappear." The line went quiet for a few seconds. Then Evelyn said, "I need a little more time." "Take all the time you need," he replied. After they hung up, Evelyn stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the twilight. The porch light glowed faintly. The dishes were drying in the rack. Sophie's laughter drifted in from the bedroom, and slowly, gently, the weight on her chest eased, just slightly. That night, before bed, Evelyn opened the drawer beside her bed and pulled out an old photo album. Inside were pictures she hadn't looked at in years. Sophie as a baby, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. Evelyn at 24, eyes hollow from exhaustion, but still clinging to hope. Pages filled with moments she had fought to preserve, even when the world gave her little reason to believe in better days. She ran her fingers over one photo in particular, her and Sophie, sitting under a tree, both of them laughing, the sunlight catching in their hair. She remembered that day clearly. It had been ordinary. They had packed peanut butter sandwiches and walked to the park, but the laughter had come easily, and for that brief afternoon, nothing else had mattered. And Evelyn thought maybe it was time to believe in that again, not as a fantasy, but as a possibility. Not because Daniel had offered her a house or a job, but because Sophie deserved it. And maybe, just maybe, so did she. The day Evelyn finally agreed to return to the farmhouse with Daniel was not marked by any grand sign from the sky or sudden burst of clarity. It was, in truth, an unremarkable morning, the kind where the sun rose lazily behind a veil of clouds, and the wind moved through the trees without urgency. But inside Evelyn's heart, something had shifted. It wasn't certainty she felt. It was a kind of surrender. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that opens a door and whispers, "Let's see." Daniel arrived precisely when he said he would, as he always did. Punctuality, Evelyn had come to notice, was one of his quiet ways of showing respect. He didn't honk the horn or rush her out the door. He waited beside his truck, hands in his pockets, eyes gentle as she stepped out with Sophie's small hand tucked into hers. Sophie wore her sunflower dress again, the same one from the first visit. She had asked to wear it that morning without explanation, though Evelyn suspected it was her way of holding on to something that made her feel bold. Children have a way of expressing hope through ritual, even when they don't have the words for it. The drive was quiet, but not tense. Daniel didn't fill the silence with needless chatter. He let the road do the talking, the stretches of green and gold weaving around them like a soft ribbon. Evelyn stared out the window, her thoughts both heavy and strangely light. She had spent so many years walking in small, tight circles of responsibility that this movement, this gentle forward motion, felt almost like flying. When they turned onto the familiar gravel path leading to Maple Ridge Farm, Evelyn's heart fluttered in spite of herself. The house looked exactly as it had a week before, serene, unpretentious, waiting. But something about the way it stood under the soft sun made it seem more real this time, less like a dream someone else might live in, and more like a possibility waiting to be chosen. Margaret, the woman who helped manage the property, stepped onto the porch again, waving with the same easy smile. "Welcome back," she said, and it sounded like more than politeness. It sounded like the beginning of something. Daniel unlocked the front door and stepped back, gesturing for Evelyn to go first. She hesitated only a second before stepping inside. The house was warm, not just in temperature but in presence. The light streamed through the windows, casting long golden shapes across the wooden floors. The smell of lavender lingered in the air, subtle but comforting. Sophie darted past her into the hallway, then into the bedroom that had already claimed her heart. Evelyn heard her voice echoing with delight, and for a moment, she allowed herself to simply listen. She walked slowly through each room, her fingers grazing the furniture, the walls, the kitchen counter. She noticed details she hadn't seen the first time: the hooks by the back door for jackets, the deep farmhouse sink, the cabinet stocked with clean dishes and thick ceramic mugs. It wasn't opulent, but it was enough, more than enough. In the back of the house, Daniel pointed toward the yard. "There's a small shed over there that used to be a gardening studio," he said. "It's clean and dry. Could be a quiet space if you ever want one." Evelyn followed his gaze. The shed sat beneath a large oak tree, half shaded, its door painted the same green as the shutters. A birdhouse hung from a nearby branch, swaying gently in the breeze. "I used to dream of having a garden," she murmured almost to herself. "You still can," Daniel replied, his voice soft. They stood in silence for a while, letting the weight of the moment stretch between them. Evelyn was not a woman who made decisions easily. Not anymore. Life had taught her that impulsive choices often led to disappointment, but as she stood in that house, with her daughter's laughter ringing like wind chimes through the halls, she realized this wasn't an impulse. It was an answer to years of waiting, to years of asking the world to just pause long enough for her to catch her breath. "I don't want this to be charity," she said, turning to Daniel. Her voice was calm but resolute. "If I accept this house, this job, it has to be because I earned it, not because you felt sorry for me." Daniel met her gaze. "You've already earned it, Evelyn. You earned it long before I knocked on your door. But if it helps, think of this as partnership. You're not a burden, you're an asset, to this place, to the people around you. I wouldn't offer this if I didn't believe in you." She nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "And Sophie?" she asked. "Will she be welcome here? Will she be safe?" Daniel smiled. "She'll be more than welcome. This place has been quiet for too long. It's time it hears laughter again." Evelyn exhaled, the kind of breath that carries more than air. It carried release, the letting go of years of doubt, of fear, of self-denial. She didn't say yes aloud, but she didn't need to. The way she stood straighter, the way her hand rested on the windowsill like it belonged there, those were answers enough. They stayed at the house for hours, letting Sophie explore every inch of the yard, from the worn tire swing to the vegetable patch that had gone wild from neglect. Evelyn walked the perimeter, imagining mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings folding laundry with the windows open, nights reading to her daughter in the room that already felt like hers. When it was time to leave, Sophie begged to stay just a little longer. Evelyn knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Oh, we'll be back soon," she promised, "but tonight we go home and pack." "Really?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Really?" Evelyn whispered. As they drove back, Evelyn felt a strange combination of exhaustion and peace settle over her. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't bracing for the next struggle. She was planning. She was choosing. Daniel didn't speak much during the ride, but his smile never faded. And when he dropped them off at her little house, he didn't linger. He simply said, "Take your time, I'll be around." That night, as Evelyn folded the last of Sophie's clothes into a box, she looked around the home that had held so much of their struggle and strength. It had been more than shelter. It had been proof of her resilience. But now it was time for something else, not escape, not fantasy, just a new chapter. A beginning, born not of desperation, but of quiet hope. The move happened in a series of quiet, intentional steps. No trucks with loud engines, no crowds of friends or neighbors lending a hand. Just Evelyn, Sophie, and Daniel working side by side. There was a gentle dignity in how it all unfolded, as though the universe itself understood that this chapter deserved to begin softly, without spectacle. Daniel arrived early on a cool Tuesday morning, his sleeves rolled up and his truck already half full with boxes from the previous night. Evelyn had stayed up late packing, not because there was too much to sort, but because every item held a memory she needed to touch one last time before letting go. She didn't cry, not once. Not even when she folded Sophie's old baby clothes into a bin or wrapped the chipped teacup that had belonged to her grandmother in layers of paper. There was no sorrow in the farewell, only reverence. The small house that had sheltered their most difficult years had been a fortress, a teacher, a quiet witness to everything she'd endured. But now it was time to thank it for its service and step into something new. Sophie, ever curious, moved from room to room with her rabbit in tow, narrating the process as if it were a grand adventure. Evelyn watched her daughter's energy and let herself feel the gift of that lightness. It was rare, precious, and it was proof that the decision she'd made wasn't just right, it was timely. By mid-afternoon, the last box was loaded, the last drawer emptied. Evelyn stood at the front door for a moment, her hand resting on the frame. Daniel didn't rush her. He waited at the bottom of the steps, his gaze steady but unobtrusive. Evelyn took one last look around. She whispered a quiet goodbye, not with words, but with her breath, and turned to face forward. The drive to the farmhouse felt different this time. Not a visit, not a test, a return. The winding roads no longer felt unfamiliar. The trees, once strangers, now seemed like silent witnesses ready to greet them. When they pulled into the gravel driveway, the house stood in the golden light of late afternoon, just as they'd left it, but this time it felt alive. Not a place being visited, but a place being claimed. Margaret had prepared everything with care. Fresh linens on the beds, the refrigerator stocked with essentials, a small bouquet of wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, not from fear, but from the aching tenderness of being received with such kindness. Sophie darted into her room, squealing with joy as she discovered that the books on the shelf had multiplied. "Someone added more fairy tales," she shouted. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Daniel. He said nothing, but the corners of his mouth lifted slightly, his way of saying, "Yes, that was me," without turning it into a performance. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unpacking, organizing, and quiet settling. Daniel stayed for most of it, never overstepping, always helping. He moved furniture like it was second nature, hung a few photos Evelyn had brought, and made small repairs she hadn't even noticed were needed. At one point, he stepped outside and returned with a basket of apples from the orchard behind the house. "They're not perfect," he said, "but they're real, like us." That night, as twilight wrapped the sky in dusky pink, Evelyn stood by the kitchen window, her hands resting on the edge of the sink. She watched Sophie running barefoot in the yard, chasing fireflies, her laughter floating through the air like a song. There was no worry in her movements, no tension in her limbs. She was safe. She was home. Behind her, Daniel stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. "She's already rooted here," he said, handing one to Evelyn. "She always adapts," Evelyn replied. "Faster than I do." He leaned against the doorframe. "That's because she believes in magic." Evelyn took a sip of tea. "And I've learned to believe in effort. Maybe they're not so different," he said gently. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the light shift outside, the fireflies glowing brighter against the darkening sky. It wasn't romance that filled the space between them, not yet. It was something slower, deeper, a mutual respect, a shared recognition of what had been lost and what might still be found. Over the next few weeks, Evelyn settled into her new role at the farm's office. At first, she doubted herself. The systems were new, the terms unfamiliar, the pace different from the physical work she had known all her life. But Daniel had been true to his word. He provided training, guidance, and most importantly, patience. He didn't hover, he empowered. And Evelyn in turn surprised herself. She learned quickly, adapted to the tasks, and began organizing the office with a quiet efficiency that impressed even the most seasoned staff. Margaret, who had been skeptical at first, quickly became a quiet supporter, often telling others, "That woman's got grit, the good kind." Sophie thrived in her new environment. The nearby school welcomed her with open arms, and her teacher sent home glowing reports. She made friends, explored the orchard trails on weekends, and began drawing pictures of the farmhouse that now filled the fridge door with color and imagination. Evelyn still woke some nights expecting to feel the weight of worry pressing down on her chest, but the weight had lessened. There were still bills to pay, still challenges to face, but they were no longer insurmountable. She was no longer doing it alone. One evening, about a month after the move, Evelyn and Daniel sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The air was crisp, the kind that invited reflection. Daniel broke the silence. "Do you regret saying yes?" he asked, his voice soft. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She looked out at the trees, at the home she had once feared was too good to be true. Then she turned to him. "No," she said. "Not once. I was afraid of being disappointed, of losing it all. But now I'm more afraid of never having let myself hope." Daniel nodded. "Hope's a risk worth taking." She smiled faintly. "It is, but only when it's earned." He didn't reply with words. He reached for her hand, just lightly, his fingers brushing hers. No pressure, just presence. And in that quiet evening, with the stars beginning to appear one by one in the vast stretch of sky, Evelyn let herself feel something she hadn't in years. She was no longer holding her breath. She was finally breathing. The days turned to weeks, and the rhythm of life at Maple Ridge Farm became more than a routine for Evelyn. It became a comfort. A kind of quiet certainty wrapped itself around her days. The clinking of mugs in the early morning, the hum of the office printer, the low murmur of staff meetings, the sound of Sophie's laughter echoing through the house each evening, all of it wove together into a tapestry of something Evelyn had never allowed herself to imagine she might one day possess. Not just stability, not just peace, but belonging. Daniel remained a steady presence, not just in the workplace, but in their lives. Yet he never imposed, never assumed, never stepped beyond the boundaries Evelyn hadn't yet invited him to cross. He came by the house with vegetables from the garden, small repairs that needed no urgent fixing, or books he thought Sophie might like. Sometimes he stayed for tea. Other times he simply checked in with a smile and a, "How was your day?" That never felt hollow. What grew between them was not built on declarations or dramatics. It was constructed instead in the quiet spaces, in shared glances during long meetings, in the way he waited for her to speak first when she was deep in thought, in how she remembered his coffee exactly the way he liked it, no sugar, a splash of cream, and how he never forgot to ask Sophie about her spelling tests or art projects. It was on one such evening, when the air had cooled and the stars were beginning to pierce the sky like silver needles, that Evelyn found herself sitting beside Daniel on the porch swing, wrapped in a silence that felt less like absence and more like fullness. Sophie had already gone to bed, her hair still damp from a warm bath, her rabbit tucked neatly beneath her chin. Daniel rocked the swing gently with one foot, the wooden floor creaking beneath them in a soft, familiar rhythm. His elbow brushed hers lightly as he leaned back. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked, his voice quiet, meant for that moment alone. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She looked out at the darkened fields, at the faint shimmer of fireflies dancing above the grass. Then she nodded. "All the time," she said, "if I hadn't taken that road, if the storm hadn't pushed me off course, if your porch light had been off, She turned to him. You'd still be you. I'd still be me, just in different corners of the world. But something brought me here, he said. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying him. You believe in that sort of thing? He smiled, not entirely answering. Let's just say I've learned not to dismiss what doesn't fit neatly into explanations. There was a pause. Then he added, being here, getting to know you, Sophie, this place, it's not something I take lightly. I don't know what it looks like down the road, but I do know this is where I want to be, with you. It wasn't a proposal, not even a confession in the traditional sense. It was something simpler, something more grounded, a truth spoken softly but with unwavering intent. Evelyn didn't look away. She didn't retreat. But she didn't answer right away either. She was a woman who had learned the cost of rushing into things. A woman who had weathered too many storms to mistake every clearing sky for calm. And yet her hand, resting on the swing's armrest, inched slightly toward his. Daniel noticed. He didn't reach for it, didn't close the gap. He let her lead. I've built walls, she said finally. Not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. I know, he said gently. And I don't tear them down for just anyone. He nodded. I wouldn't want you to. Another silence passed, and in it Evelyn leaned slightly toward him. Not much, just enough. But maybe, she said, I'm ready to leave the door open. A little. Daniel smiled, and this time it wasn't just in his mouth. It reached his eyes, softened the lines around them, lit something warm behind his gaze. I can wait for the rest, he said. That evening, they didn't touch. There were no embraces, no sudden turning points. Just two people sitting side by side, the swing rocking gently beneath them, the night humming around them like a lullaby. But something had shifted, something unspoken, but deeply understood. Over the next several weeks, that unspoken connection deepened. Evelyn found herself thinking of him during her quietest moments, wondering what he might say about a passage she read in a novel, what dish he'd pair with the soup she planned for dinner. Sophie, ever intuitive, began referring to him as the friend who's always here, and once, quite unprompted, asked Evelyn if she thought Daniel would still be around when her next birthday came. Evelyn didn't answer right away, but later that night, as she stood by the kitchen window and saw Daniel's truck lights disappear into the trees, she whispered, I hope so. And when Daniel invited her to visit the nearby farmer's market one Saturday morning, not as a boss, not even as a neighbor, but as company, Evelyn said yes. Not because she needed the outing, but because she wanted to share space with him beyond the edges of work and home. They walked through rows of stalls with baskets in hand, Sophie skipping ahead to marvel at jars of honey and stacks of apples. Daniel bought her a small potted herb plant, saying, For your windowsill. Every kitchen needs one. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time someone had bought her something that wasn't practical or necessary, but simply thoughtful. Their connection became something that didn't need to be labeled. It lived in the everyday, in the way Daniel kept a spare raincoat for Evelyn in his truck, in the way she left small containers of leftovers in his office fridge when she cooked too much, in how they shared stories about their pasts, not in a rush to unload them but slowly, carefully, like handing someone an old photograph and saying, This was me once. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And for a woman like Evelyn, who had spent so many years believing she had to protect herself from anything that looked like love, the slow unfolding of something true was the gentlest and most profound gift life had given her in a very long time. And for Daniel, who had once measured success by property lines and bank balances, the simple joy of being trusted by a woman like Evelyn and loved quietly by a child like Sophie was worth more than anything he had ever owned. The seasons began to change without ceremony, as they often do in places that know how to take their time. The summer heat softened into early autumn cool, and the trees along the road to Maple Ridge Farm exchanged their green robes for warm tones of amber and rust. There was something calming about the way the land shifted, quietly, without asking for permission, without fanfare. It simply moved forward, one breath at a time, much like Evelyn had. She found herself waking earlier these days, not from restlessness, but from readiness. The first moments of morning belonged to her. She would wrap herself in the thick cardigan Margaret had gifted her from the back of her closet, pad barefoot into the kitchen, and stand by the window with a steaming mug in hand. The view outside never ceased to surprise her. Each day offered a different sky, a new texture of light through the trees, and a stillness that never felt lonely. The home, once unfamiliar, had become an extension of her. The walls no longer echoed. They held warmth. They remembered laughter. Sophie's artwork adorned the refrigerator. Her boots always sat by the back door, and her giggles rang down the hallway with comforting frequency. Her world had expanded, slowly and sweetly, and Evelyn saw it reflected in her daughter's posture, more confident, more at ease. In the evenings, Daniel would often stop by. Sometimes it was to bring her a new book she hadn't asked for, sometimes just to share the leftovers from something he'd cooked too much of. He never stayed too long unless invited. He never pushed. His presence was consistent but gentle, like the sound of rain on a roof or the scent of something baking in the oven. It was that rare kind of companionship built not on need, but on choice. One evening, as Evelyn tidied up after dinner, she caught herself humming, a tune from her childhood, something she hadn't thought of in decades. She paused, spoon in hand, and realized she was smiling without effort. The realization didn't frighten her. It comforted her. After Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel lingered on the porch, seated in the same spot they had shared so many times before. Evelyn joined him with 2 cups of tea, offering one without a word. They sipped in silence for a while, watching as the stars gathered above them. The chill in the air made her grateful for the soft blanket draped over her shoulders. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, not looking at her. Evelyn turned slightly, sensing something behind his tone. "About what?" "About that night," he said. "The one with the storm." She nodded. "I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't knocked on your door. Maybe I would have slept in the car. Maybe someone else would have helped. But I don't think I would have felt what I feel now. Not just about you, about myself, about everything." Evelyn didn't speak. She let him finish. "I've had success," he continued. "I've had comfort. But I didn't know connection. Not really. I didn't know what it meant to trust the quiet between 2 people, or to feel changed just by being near someone who carries grace in everything she does." She felt the warmth rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Daniel finally turned to face her. "I don't need to define what we are right now. I just want you to know that wherever this goes, I'm here, fully, willingly, not out of gratitude anymore, but out of something deeper." It wasn't a declaration of love in the grand sense, but for Evelyn it was more powerful. Because it was real, because it was patient, because it saw her not as someone to be saved or solved, but as someone to be honored. She reached for his hand, resting between them. Her fingers brushed his, then held on. "I spent a long time thinking I didn't deserve a life like this," she said softly. "That safety, and love, and peace were for other people. People who hadn't made mistakes, who hadn't struggled. But this house, this job, it's teaching me something else." Daniel nodded, his thumb lightly brushing over hers. "You didn't just come into my life, Daniel. You reminded me how to live it." And that was enough. That was everything. The months that followed continued the way all good lives do. Not with grand gestures, but with consistency. Evelyn thrived in her role on the farm. Her ideas were valued, her presence respected. Sophie's days were full of discovery. Books, friends, animals she grew attached to, and moments with Daniel that slowly evolved from curiosity to affection. On Sophie's birthday, Daniel surprised her with a small tree, a flowering dogwood, to plant in the backyard. Together, the 3 of them dug the hole, lowered the sapling, and covered its roots with earth. Evelyn watched them, her daughter and the man who had once been a stranger on her porch, and felt something settle in her heart. Not a rush, not a spark, but the quiet certainty of growth. Later that evening, after the cake had been cut and the gifts unwrapped, Sophie asked if she could go outside and say goodnight to the tree. Evelyn followed her to the yard. The stars had returned, scattered like blessings across the sky. Sophie knelt beside the tree, whispered something Evelyn couldn't hear, then stood and took her mother's hand. "He's your special friend, isn't he?" Sophie asked. Evelyn smiled, brushing a curl from her daughter's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, he is. Are we going to stay here forever?" Evelyn looked up at the house, the porch light glowing softly, the windows golden with life inside. and then at the tree they had just planted. "I think we've already started," she said. And as the wind moved through the branches, as the leaves whispered their quiet song, Evelyn finally let herself feel the fullness of what had happened. A knock at the door had changed her life, not because it brought a man, but because it reminded her that kindness still exists, that second chances come not with fireworks, but with patience, that healing happens when someone sits beside you long enough for the silence to feel like home. She had survived. Now she was living. And as she stood beneath the stars, hand in hand with her daughter, she knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the one she had waited her whole life to tell. As the wind carried the scent of the fields and the memory of storms long past, Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered to the night, "Thank you."